Balancing the Exposure Triangle in Cinematography, the Complete Guide. We are Grimehouse Films. Welcome to our video on balancing the exposure triangle in cinematography. Mastering the exposure triangle, consisting of aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, is essential for every aspiring filmmaker. In this video, we'll explore how to balance these elements to achieve the perfect exposure and create visually stunning footage. Understanding the exposure triangle. The exposure triangle is a fundamental concept in cinematography that describes the relationship between aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. These three elements work together to control the amount of light captured by the camera and determine the overall exposure of your footage. A proper balance between them ensures that your images are neither too dark nor too bright, with the desired depth of field, motion portrayal, and image quality. Balancing aperture. Aperture controls the size of the opening within the lens, affecting the amount of light entering the camera and the depth of field in your footage. Lower f-stop numbers represent a larger aperture, resulting in a brighter image and shallower depth of field. Higher f-stop numbers correspond to a smaller aperture, creating a darker image and deeper depth of field. When balancing aperture, consider its impact on exposure and depth of field, and how it relates to shutter speed and ISO. Balancing shutter speed. Shutter speed determines the duration of light exposure on the camera sensor. Faster shutter speeds result in a shorter exposure, freezing motion and producing a darker image. Slower shutter speeds produce a longer exposure, introducing motion blur and yielding a brighter image. When balancing shutter speed, consider its impact on exposure and motion portrayal, and how it relates to aperture and ISO. Balancing ISO. ISO measures the sensitivity of your camera's sensor to light. Higher ISO values increase the sensor's sensitivity, allowing you to capture images in low light conditions at the expense of increased noise or grain. Lower ISO values decrease the sensor's sensitivity, making it ideal for well-lit environments and producing cleaner images. When balancing ISO, consider its impact on exposure and image quality, and how it relates to aperture and shutter speed. Achieving the perfect balance. Determine your creative goals. Before you begin adjusting the elements of the exposure triangle, consider your creative vision for the scene. This will help you make informed decisions about the depth of field, motion portrayal, and image quality you wish to achieve. Start with one element. Begin by setting one element of the exposure triangle according to your creative goals. For instance, if you want a shallow depth of field, start with a large aperture. Adjust the remaining elements. Once you've set your primary element, adjust the other two components to achieve the desired exposure. For example, if you've chosen a large aperture and the image is too bright, you may need to increase the shutter speed or decrease the ISO to balance the exposure. Review and fine-tune. Continuously review your footage and make minor adjustments as necessary to achieve the perfect balance between aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Tips for balancing the exposure triangle. Familiarize yourself with your camera's native ISO and use it as a starting point for setting exposure. Remember the 180-degree shutter rule to achieve natural-looking motion blur, and adjust it according to your creative vision. Invest in fast lenses with wide apertures to provide greater flexibility in controlling depth of field and working in low light conditions. Use external lighting sources and ND filters to manipulate the amount of light in your scene, giving you more control over the exposure triangle. Conclusion. Balancing the exposure triangle is crucial for achieving the perfect exposure and creating visually stunning footage. By understanding the relationship between aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, and learning how to balance these elements, you'll be well equipped to create dynamic and captivating images. Now it's time to put your newfound knowledge into practice and explore the creative possibilities that mastering the exposure triangle offers. Go out, experiment, and let your vision come to life on screen.